Hey everybody, Brandon, United Commercial Insurance here. So wanted to share a few things that I learned or I saw at a conference I just went to last week in Georgia, a major insurance carrier for the trucking industry. Through a conference I went to, I thought it was really interesting. Here's some videos about it. But one of the things that was talked about a lot was the liability limits for trucking, for hire trucking, companies that have an MC number, what they're required to have for insurance liability, right? And so right now, the insurance liability that's standard typically is $750,000 liability. And that goes for the majority of carriers. If you're an auto hauler, a lot of times you're gonna get put at $1 million, or if you're at hazmat, you're gonna be at $5 million, but for the most part, you're 750. And I thought it was really interesting. The guy that they brought in was Jim Mullins, and he was the former director of the FMCSA under the Trump administration. And he, I believe, left office in 2020. Anyway, he's doing a consulting firm, and links in the bio on his consulting firm here. But he was really interesting to listen to, and how he talked about the history of where that liability limit came from, the likelihood of where changing that liability limit would take us, and what that meant. So just to give you some background, the liability limit, $750,000, that's supposed to cover any damage that the trucker is liable for. So if you're driving along on the freeway, you run into some cars or a building, the damage that you cause is the liability limit to both property damage and bodily injury to people either in the vehicles or walking around that get injured, whatever that is. And essentially what he said was that that limit, 750, was sort of picked out of a hat in the 80s. There was no rhyme or reason to why that number was picked. And it's been that way for the last, close to 40 years. And so some legislators in Congress have discussed increasing it from anywhere to 2 million to 5 million for every carrier. And that could mean a lot for hire carriers. And so it's a big item of discussion. And so that theme came up, and Jim, when he said, hey, what's the likelihood of the limits to go up 750, just flat out said it'll never happen. It'll never happen, or at least for the immediate future, that they're not going to increase it. I mean, the government's so slow. Changes that they proposed years ago are still in the comment stage, and they essentially, even if they pass, they oftentimes put on a new or a deadline on when that needs to go through, and then that deadline comes and goes and they take it off. And so this one was really interesting. He flat out said never happen, though they're never going to increase it to 5 million or to 2 million. And he could be right. I don't know. I've been working with the DOT for this job 11 years, and then 6 years in my prior job, and change comes slow, if it comes at all. And so that's 15 or so years, and I've only seen a couple changes happen. I mean, ELD and the clearinghouse, those changes took so long to happen. I mean, there's so many different organizations that are invested in that, with OIDA, the small guys, the non-fleet guys, the fleet guys, that it's just gonna cost a lot of money. I mean, the reality is most large companies have well over $1 million in liability limits. Whether it's, their main policy is $1 million, and then they have an excess for 4 million or even up to 10 million. They're already doing it. It's the small non-fleet guys, the 1 to 9 guys typically, that just have the standard 1 million. If your contract doesn't require anything over $1 million, most people don't get it. So anyway, what's the right number? That's a great question. I don't think anybody knows. Is 750 the right number? Maybe. It's my personal opinion from the insurance side that the number you have on your insurance coverage is the number you're going to get sued for. And so if you have 2 million, well, that's the amount of the lawsuit. And if you have a 750, that's the amount of the lawsuit. So from the litigation side, I don't like it to go higher, because more coverage that you're required to have just makes us a bigger target. I mean, we already see the signs in almost every state: hit by a trucker, hit by a commercial auto. And there's the trial bar, the attorneys that specialize in suing commercial trucking companies, that they're making millions and millions and millions. They have conventions, private jets fly to them. They're doing really well. So I don't see why we would give them more unless we can legislate the trial attorneys from suing all of these trucking companies that typically aren't at fault. If we can do that, then I'd be more in favor of it. But the cost for the customer, for the trucking company, is going to go way up. The cost for the insurance company is going to go way up, which dictates the price of insurance. I mean, if they're paying out $1.5 million on these large things, or $2 million if that's what the limit is, which, you know, we're paying out the limits on these large cases severity wise, that's maxing out. So I don't see a huge benefit to it. I don't think the public is, most cases, undercovered when a trucking firm gets into an accident and there's a liability. I don't think the trucking firm is not paying out enough, or the insurance company's not paying out enough. I get that it's an old limit, but I just think that the inflation, the pressure on inflation, the rising costs of doing business isn't good for the economy in general. So I don't see a huge benefit to it, from this standpoint. But if organizations or stakeholders were to present to Congress and say, hey, we're way under on these areas, and we're going to require, it's really good for the economy or for the private sector to have it to cover everybody, I'd rather just have it be driven by the economic forces that play a part. If brokers require more, if contracts require more, these large, maybe Amazon requires more, that's going to happen. I think that's a better indicator or a better justification for increasing it. But who knows? I mean, even if it's proposed right now, we're years away from it happening. So I thought that was interesting. Anyway, Jim Mullins, he's a really interesting guy. I thought he was great because he said how much he disliked government. I love that. I think government screws up way more than they do. And, it's important to have these regulations, but it's important to get it right. And jumping it to 2 million, I don't think is the right decision right now. And I think it would just cause a bigger burden on these guys that are, we rely on to, transport everything that we use. And the more we charge them, the more it's going to come around to the basic consumer. Just the pressure of inflation will rise up. So anyway, those are my thoughts. I'll post some videos about it. Maybe you can tell me your thoughts in the comments. Hopefully everybody's doing all right.